Hi, everybody, and welcome again to the Gray Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. I am Kostas, and I'm back once again with Andrew. Hello, Andrew.
Hey there, Kostas. It's great to be here as always.
It is always great to be here, yes, but you know what? It's even greater to be here today.
I agree, because today is a special podcast since we have a guest.
We do. We have a very special guest. And far be it from me to waste any more time. Let's get right to it. So today we have an administrative associate who works with Gray Fox Tutors. He's also an academic advisor with the Carmento Online Latin School. He is a member of the Order of Attorneys of Brazil and has published a number of articles on Brazilian law. He's a polyglot and a polymath, and he's also an active social media presence, whom you may know. So without further ado, let's get right to it. And let's welcome André Bastos. André, how are you?
Oh, fine. Thanks. Bene, Kostas.
Excellent. Gracias. Okay, so the title of our podcast today is Interview with a Latin Student. So I just introduced you, André, with a number of different attributions there, but the main one that we're going to be focusing on today is your experience with Latin. So talk to us a little about your experience learning Latin. What was it like? How did it come about?
Well, I must say that learning Latin was the best thing I've ever done in my life. It's like a dream came true, because my experience with Latin happens like I was like 6 or 7 years old, and I saw this old grammar in French. It was a Latin grammar that belonged to my grandfather. And there I tried to read it. And there was something there, it was an amazing experience. My father was the first one to talk to me about Latin, although he did not know much about the language of Cicero. But then I wondered, there must be something here, something amazing. I saw the paintings, I saw the pictures in the book, and I thought, these people must be amazing. But it was a pity, because no one in my city knew Latin. So I had to find an online tutor many years ago. And that's when I met Andrew.
Right. So, yeah, we all know who that tutor is.
Yeah.
Many years ago, in fact, I think it must have been about 10 years ago or almost 10 years ago.
8 years ago to be exact. Yes.
Okay, so I started tutoring André, and he was my student for a number of years. And it was, it's always interesting to take a student from the very beginning all the way to an advanced level.
That's extremely rewarding. I've only had the opportunity to do that several times in my own teaching career, but when you can do it, you get a real sense of satisfaction.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of the time we just have students for 1 or 2 years, which is unfortunate, because what I want to do, and I think this is what Latin teachers want to do generally, is actually to teach the students the language. And you can't do it in a couple of years. Even if you are a super teacher like Kostas, it's impossible. You need a bit more time than that.
But you flatter me.
I do my best. But I was wondering, André, if you could just talk a bit about your experience of learning Latin, how it went, what the details of it were, etc.
Yeah, it went great, because my teacher, he was very strict, and I like that. I like that he was strict with me. He wanted to make sure that I knew all the grammar before we moved to another lesson. We made sure to read the whole book. We did the Primer of Ecclesiastical Latin by Collins, and then we went to the Wheelock's grammar. And He wanted to make sure that I knew 100% of everything. There should be no time for mistakes. In this way, I got my grammar. I think it might sound like I'm exaggerating, but I believe that I know Latin grammar better than Portuguese.
Mm.
Right, which is your native language, right?
Yes, yes.
And it's entirely possible. As you said, Andre, people may think you're exaggerating when you say that, but if you have the proper course of study... Yeah, you go ahead. I'm sorry, yes.
In fact, there is a sentence by one of our greatest philologists. He died a few years ago. And a well-known philologist, he said that without much Latin, without a lot of Latin, you are not going to be able to know even little Portuguese.
Absolutely, yeah. Naturally, because of the innate relationship that exists, of course, between Portuguese and Latin.
And not only that, but because Portuguese grammar, and that goes for all Romance languages, it doesn't make sense unless you study Latin.
Yeah.
And that's why we got a generation here of people who can't master their own mother language's grammar.
You bring up a really interesting point here, because talking about learning Latin from an English speaker's perspective, of course, when you learn Latin grammar, you are forced to learn things about English grammar that almost are not taught anymore in the schools. And I always tell people, I think I was sort of at the end of when they were teaching things like how to diagram a sentence, or what predicates are, or things like this that you just don't hear mentioned very much anymore. But Latin forces you to learn those things. And it's really interesting, Andre, to hear you say as well, on the other side of things. Of course, English is not a Romance language, although it's heavily influenced naturally by French, which is one. Portuguese, of course, is a Romance language. And the same sort of phenomenon exists there, where if you learn Latin grammar, you have a tremendous understanding then of Portuguese grammar, and the same is true for the other Romance languages.
Yes.
Yeah, so just let me jump in here. And I want to say, first of all, that I would maybe dispute that English is not a Romance language. But, I think that's, it's, people choose to classify things in different ways. But you talked, Andre, about how we went through the grammar step by step, and this is what I definitely always try to do, go through step by step. It's very important that the student know the more basic grammar before moving on to more complex grammar. It has to go step by... Yeah, sorry, go on.
There was another thing that we did that was very interesting, that made me realize how great it is to study Latin. We actually spoke Latin. Mm-hmm. We did not think, Latin is a dead language. When I hear people say that Latin is a dead language, I go nuts.
And rightfully so.
It's true.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and we actually spoke. We felt like we were there. Latin was alive whenever I met Andrew.
And this is something, of course, that Andrew and I have said repeatedly on this podcast, and we said it again in the last episode of the show, how speaking the language is something that must happen in order for the students to get a full understanding of it, if only from the aspect of vocabulary, because you cannot adequately learn, or even halfway adequately, in my opinion, you can't learn vocabulary just by memorizing a list of words. You have to use it. Languages were meant to be spoken, not to be memorized.
Yes, in fact, something funny happened to me recently, because I only did a reading in Sanskrit, you see, not really having dialogues in Sanskrit. But one day, my, which happens to be a Great Fox tutor, Eric Orgo, he asked me, so how do you like to do a language exchange with me? I teach you Old Occitan, and you speak some Sanskrit with me. I've been studying Sanskrit for 4 years now. I can read fairly well with the help of a dictionary, of course, but I never spoke Sanskrit. But now my Sanskrit vocab is much better because I'm speaking Sanskrit.
Absolutely. And that's something that I'm sure you probably would not have had near the amount of success with just by memorizing the words, but by using them in conversation. That has enabled you to learn them.
Yes, I think everyone should try that. And he wants to try Acadian conversation with me in a few months. It sounds a bit crazy, but I'm all for it. Yeah.
Okay, so we should probably give a little backstory here. In the beginning, I introduced Andre as a polyglot, which of course is one who speaks many languages. Now, we've already mentioned two of those, or three if we're including Latin here, but Sanskrit and Akkadian as well. Andre, tell everyone what other languages you speak. So if we make some references, they'll understand what we're talking about.
Well, for ancient and classical languages, I study Latin, ancient Greek, both Attic and Homeric Greek. Mm-hmm. I study Old Occitan. I do classical Chinese poetry, Akkadian, and Sanskrit. For the modern languages, I speak English, German, French, Italian, Spanish. My Chinese is pretty good. At least my teacher says so. Although I can't read it, it takes a long time to learn all the ideograms. But yes. I'm working on it.
That's a completely different challenge all to itself.
Yeah, it's true.
Okay,
and that's and I also study on my own more obscure languages that very few people have heard about, like Sicilian and Napolitan, that are nowadays seen as dialects. But in my point of view, they are languages and they must be preserved. I also study Scottish Gaelic, which is a language that sadly is dying in Scotland with only 80,000 speakers. I feel like this language must be preserved and they must be spoken daily, just like when Andrew and I did with Latin.
Yeah, and we'll be talking about this in the second part of the show as well, but we'll be talking about how having learned Latin almost assuredly helped broaden your horizons into working with those other languages. But if we could just back up for one moment now, just to sort of recap everything that we've been saying here about your initial experience in learning Latin, I think we're saying you had this two-pronged approach that Andrew and I talk about all the time, where there's grammar and translation on the one hand, but there's conversation on the other. And so you're getting it from both ends, and you're getting a complete education this way.
Yes.
Okay, and what are some of the benefits that you've been able to experience as a result of your learning Latin? What has come about for you? I mean, would it be fair to say this has been a life-changing thing for you?
Well, yes. In your case, because you speak English as your mother language, but in my case, I speak Brazilian Portuguese as my mother language. I must say that I felt like a Superman. Yeah, I'm not kidding. Because when I started learning Latin with Andrew, I was at law school, and the teacher gave me a text, an exam, and it's boring. I realized that I wasn't. I'm more like a classicist. I prefer to study classics rather than law, although I like law. But when I was done reading it, I started writing the etymology of each Portuguese word. And when I gave back the drill, the teacher looked at me and said, "What is that?" I said, "Oh, it's Latin." I was feeling a wee bit bored, so I wrote all the etymology of the words here. And he looked at me and said, "Is this man crazy or what?" And I felt like a Superman. That's my point. And I started reading like crazy. Even my own language, I had a lot of trouble understanding Brazilian poetry. You see, because they actually imitate classical authors like Virgil. And the moment I knew about declensions, about word order, I realized, oh, this writer here is not so difficult at all. People don't like him because they don't know basic Latin. basic Latin grammar.
Yeah, and of course we're extolling the virtues of Latin here, and I'm fairly certain we're probably preaching to the choir for our listeners when we talk about how wonderful Latin is and all the great things that can come from it. And you mentioned, of course, the etymologies, which is a major thing, and that was something that I always found interesting. Your vocabulary in general, I'm sure, has just increased.
And of course, great literature.
Yes.
I don't think my life would be the same without Catullus, without Cicero. I was terrified of speaking in public, which is something terrible as I'm a teacher. So if I can speak in public, it's because I used to read the In Catilinam out loud for several days. I tried to pretend that I was there in the Senate. I was there accusing Catilina.
How far did you take it? Did you dress up?
Oh, I felt like it, although I wasn't able to find a toga anywhere around here.
Oh, okay.
Well, I might buy one, actually.
Let me just jump in here because I want to talk about another aspect of this. The way that we approached learning Latin, André. So when I was teaching you, what we did was we started off with grammar, we took it step by step, but then we also early started speaking the language. And the great thing about André is he didn't know any different. So because he'd done this with every other language he learned, he was very eager to start speaking Latin. He had no problem with doing that. And this kind of relates to something we talked about last week, that I think a lot of the reason people are afraid of speaking Latin is that they've heard so many times that they can't do it. Mm-hmm. But when you never hear that, when it just seems normal to speak Latin, and this is actually my experience with most younger students we have, they have no idea that they shouldn't speak it. It seems totally normal that they would speak it. Then they don't have any fear of it at all, and they just do it, and they get better and better as they go, just as it is with the grammar part of Latin. But another aspect of what we did was our progression with reading. So as André said, we started with the textbooks. So we actually did Collins, A Primer of Ecclesiastical Latin, and then we did Wheelock's Latin. And then after that, we moved into real Latin authors. But unlike most teachers, I don't believe in jumping into Cicero or Virgil. I don't think that's a good idea. I actually believe in something that sounds a little odd to a lot of people, but I believe in quantity over quality. So,
Andrew, I think you might have just shocked our audience. Let's give them a minute to recompose.
I mean, it is a shocking thing to say because it's you hear your entire life that quality is more important than quantity, but not in this case. And if you think back to how you learned to read English, what you did was you started with Dick and Jane, maybe in kindergarten or first grade. And then you very gradually moved to more and more difficult authors in English. You didn't start with Shakespeare, but I've noticed most of the time, and I think this really has more to do with this need for some reason to teach Latin in 4 years with, just finish it at that point. There's this tendency for students to get through basic grammar and then jump into really difficult authors, and they're not ready for them. And when they do this, they end up spending hours just translating a single paragraph. And I don't think that's an effective way to do it. It's much more effective to read a very large quantity. And so what I try to do, and this is what I did with Andre, we started with authors who were much more manageable and authors Andre could read through quickly. So we began with Eutropius, I remember. And then at a certain point, we moved on to Catullus. And
we also, we did that very interesting text by Augustus himself, the emperor, the Res Gestae Divi Augusti, in which he tells his adventures. It's an account of his life, which is it's not so difficult. And I believe even intermediate Latin students can read it.
Yeah, and because we did it that way, Andre was able to move through these texts rapidly.
Yeah, and that's, in fact, it's an interesting thing that is Heinrich Schliemann's method. Heinrich Schliemann was the well-known polyglot and archaeologist. Yes. And his method to learn all the languages that he mastered was to read as much as possible. He wasn't interested in quality, but in quantity, as Andrew said.
Well, and we talked about this last week, Kostas. This method that dominates now is something that didn't really exist before the 20th century.
Exactly.
This is something that's recent. And in fact, before the 20th century, Latin was learned differently. I mean, we talked last week about how I had that conversation with my uncle, and it was just this epiphany when he talked about how not that long ago, priests had spoken Latin in a lot of their classes in the seminary, that some of their classes were in their native language, but then a lot of their classes were entirely in Latin. And the reason they did that was so that they would learn Latin. I mean, they had a Latin class, but then they knew it wasn't enough just to learn the grammar. They had to use it as much as possible in order to know the language. And if you look around now, the few people who are really fluent in Latin at this point are very old priests. And I know one in town here, actually, who is, I think he's in his 70s now, but he was in the seminary before they stopped teaching Latin in the seminary, before they moved away from Latin and went over to the native language. So this is a brand new thing. And my attitude is that it's not a good thing. The way that it's normally taught. And we talked last week about, I believe this is why the number of Latin students is dropping so rapidly. It's because they're not in a position to learn the language well. So they become less interested in it. And then, of course, they don't have the enjoyment of speaking the language, which makes it much more interesting. And so it's harder to get students to be interested and stay interested in this language. But anyway, I don't want to go on and on.
Well, why don't we give everyone a few seconds to digest that truth bomb you just dropped, and let's take a quick break here. And when we come back, we'll continue talking about what the best way is to learn Latin, and we'll also ask Andre to compare and contrast learning Latin with some of the other languages he knows as well. So we will be right back right after this.
Thanks so much for listening to the Gray Fox Latin Teachers Podcast. I'd like to talk for a minute about how you can help sustain all of our free Gray Fox Latin teacher resources, including our conversational Latin textbook, Latin podcasts, Latin resources archives, and conversational Latin Skype workshops for Latin teachers. Gray Fox believes in giving back. We do charge students for tutoring in classes, but because we believe Latin is for everyone and not just the few, We also offer free professional development workshops for teachers. So that we can keep on offering and expanding these opportunities, please consider referring people who need tutoring or are interested in languages beyond your purview. If you have a student whose complicated schedule makes meeting in person with a tutor difficult, please consider referring him or her to Gray Fox. Because our tutors and teachers are located in multiple time zones and all tutoring is done online, there will always be a tutor available at the time you need. If your students are frustrated by tutoring from peers or college students who disappear as soon as midterms start, please consider referring them to Gray Fox. We've been in operation since 2008, employing several dozen elite tutors. We are reliable and always available.
Okay, and we're back, and we are talking with our special guest today, André Bastos, and we've been spending the last 25 minutes or so talking about Andre's experience learning Latin, and we just started venturing off into talking about what we feel is the best way to learn Latin based on all the different methods that people have done and what we've done. And André, something else I know you've done also when you were learning Latin, you talked about making these charts for yourself, declension charts and comparisons with other languages in terms of the vocab. Talk a little about that for the listeners.
Oh, well, I think that when you create something like a word database or a vocab charts, your brain, your mind goes, you actually learn it much better. Because you can compare languages, you can compare and compare Latin with your mother language, compare Latin with other Romance languages, create like it's something I call the Latin database, where I write a word in Latin, and then I write the declensions, and then I write one or two. I make up sentences using that word. And then I try and create more. I am always trying to exercise my brain. It's and I think that Latin should be learned in this way because it's a far more complex language than Spanish or French. It requires discipline, and as we said before, it's now. I think the moment you see Latin as a dead language, that's that makes you feel like it's not worth studying it. You must speak Latin.
Yeah.
You must feel Latin. And but to do this, you must come up. You must have discipline. You must study hard. But I'm pretty sure that if he uses a method like as we said before at the first part, we go through the grammar and make sure that you know everything of the grammar. And then you create these charts I mentioned, because this way it's much harder to forget words in Latin.
And I just want to jump in. I would say that then what you need to do is speak the language, converse in the language as much as you possibly can. Because that way you not only learn vocabulary very quickly, but you never forget it once you've learned it. I mean, what's your opinion about that, André?
At the moment you speak a language, it's you learn it much faster. Why is it that now that today people only care about reading Latin? It's because they see it as a dead language. They only want to read it to have access to classics, and sometimes even because they wish to pass an exam. That's it. But one has to feel Latin, feel as a language that is alive in all of us.
And that's a great point. Yes, I'm sorry.
And
go ahead.
I just want to say that because of that, it's extremely important that when students are first introduced to the language, they're not made to see it as a dead language.
Right. Yes, and sometimes I challenge people. I ask them when they always bully me and say, why are you learning Latin? That's a dead language. It's useless. No one speaks it. And I ask, why do you think Latin is a dead language?
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
speak
I
Latin.
mean,
My
I
tutor
can't.
speaks Latin.
I can't tell you the number of times that's happened to me. So somebody says, "What do you do?" You know, because I don't know, you're at a cocktail party. I don't go to
It's happened
cocktail
to all of
parties.
us, I'm sure.
Yeah, but they say, "What do you do?" And you say, "Well, I'm a Latin teacher." And they say, "A Latin teacher, but isn't that a dead language? Why would you do that?" Or they'll say, "But nobody speaks Latin. What's the point of that?" And my response always is, "I speak Latin. My students speak Latin. There are other people I know who speak Latin. So I don't consider it a dead language at all. It isn't dead to us.
Yeah.
To
And
us, it's totally alive."
Andre, you made a
And,
great point when you said that people are, it seems as though people have this opinion that only people who are interested in reading classical texts are taking Latin. And Andrew, you and I were talking last week about this, and you made a great point when you said that people who want to read the classics need to speak it first, because if they speak it first, they'll get there so much faster when they try to read, as if they compared to if they hadn't done that.
Right. So it's one of those things that sounds logical to somebody who doesn't know anything about it. The idea that it'll be more efficient if I just don't speak it, but I just start reading as soon as possible because reading is what I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. It's like having your kid learn to ride a bicycle before he learns how to walk.
Yeah.
I mean, it's absolute insanity if you actually know anything about how languages are really learned by people. And, you know, I'm all about doing what's effective, whatever that is. You know, I didn't get to this point and have these views on teaching Latin because I decided one day, well, this is what I believe and I'm going to push it no matter what. No. It's because I tried a lot of different things. I wanted to figure out what was right and what was wrong. And over time, it became clear that this was the most useful approach for learning the language. But another thing I think we should talk about when it comes to Andre is that, and you've maybe gotten a sense of this already, Andre, you have studied a lot of different languages, haven't you?
Yes.
I mean, could you maybe list them for us? Give us, or maybe,
We did this before the break, but it's worth doing again.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you've learned modern languages, ancient languages, Western languages, Eastern languages. How would you compare learning those languages to learning Latin? Or, would you say that there are many similarities, that there are differences? Is Latin totally different from all other languages? I mean, what's your thought about the commonalities and differences when it comes to learning these different languages?
Latin, I would say it's when it comes to difficulty, the difficulty is about the same as ancient Greek, but Latin is a complex language. But I must say there are even more complex languages as well. Well, I studied the Romance languages, and when I did so, when I studied Spanish, French, Italian, I learned it in much faster because of my Latin background. And then I went to Germanic languages as well. I speak German and I know a little Danish. But the good thing about Latin is that it made me realize that classical and ancient languages are never enough. That's why I went to Anglo-Saxon as well, and Old Babylonia, which I learned with a tutor from Grey Fox as well, Eric Argo. I also do Sanskrit, and I'm interested in more obscure languages as well. People seem to despise those. Sometimes they say, "Oh, that's a worthless dialect," but it isn't. There is great literature in Sicilian, Napolitano, Ladino, which is the language of the Sephardic Jews in Spain. When you ask me about the similarities, it's hard to say because every language has its own individuality. While Chinese, for example, the grammar is quite simple. Compared to Latin, Chinese grammar is a piece of cake. But if we compare Latin grammar with Babylonian grammar, it is or Sanskrit grammar, it's far worse. Or even the worst of all, it's Old Irish. They say it's, at least my tutor knows Old Irish, and he says it's a nightmare. But
Okay,
even so, I
Yes.
feel like every language you learn, it's like a whole new horizon for you. The French have a saying that learning a language is like being born again, and that's how I felt when I learned Latin and ancient Greek, and I'm learning Sanskrit. It's like you become a new person.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying, Andre, is that there is worth and value in every language that you learn, even if it's not immediately apparent to someone, and they say, "Oh, well, that's not spoken anymore. What can you do with it?" I think you just disproved that old, tired retort to things by saying everything that you did there. So let's assume for a moment, Andre, that a student comes to you and says, "I want to learn Spanish," and another student comes to you and says, "I want to learn Latin." What can the student who is looking to learn Latin expect compared with what the student who is going to learn Spanish expect?
Well, so far, I've only had one Latin student, and he wanted to read the classics, but I convinced him to speak Latin as well, and he had a great time. And the Spanish student is already, his goal is the other way around. He wants to speak Spanish and sometimes just to go to Argentina for a couple of days and learn how to order something in a restaurant. Although I did have, I'm kidding here, but I did have some very nice students as well of Romance languages. But
Well, yeah.
their goal is mostly communication, while when a student comes to me for Latin, their goal is for reading classics.
Yeah, so I just want to jump in here and say that there tends to be those two extremes. So when students are learning modern language, whatever the modern language is, there is a tendency to be too extreme in the direction of conversation. But when students are learning ancient languages, there is a tendency to be too extreme in the direction of grammar. And my feeling is it doesn't matter whether it's a modern or an ancient language. They're all languages. No matter what the language is, the ideal approach is a combination of grammar study and speaking the language. I mean, what do you think about that, Andre?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. It's you can't have half. You must have both, 100%. When you learn to speak a language, it's not only well, I would feel like I wasn't complete if I only knew how to read Latin. Mm-hmm. And besides, if you learn to speak Latin, reading Latin is going to come a lot faster.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I would also say we talk about a language being alive. I think that the experience people have of Latin texts when they've already spoken the language quite a bit is actually different from the experience people have of a Latin text who've never spoken Latin. The text is far more alive if you've used the language in conversation with other people. I mean, I don't know if people agree or disagree with me on that, but that's definitely my feeling.
Yeah, and I mean, I touched on this before, Andrew, and I'll say it again, and I'll stand by it for now and forevermore. I don't see any other way to do it. And I mentioned before that it was baffling to me that there were people who wouldn't do that when I was first learning Latin. It just doesn't work in my mind any other way.
Yeah, and I just want to say one last time, even though, yes, we enjoy speaking the language, that makes it a lot more fun. It makes it much more meaningful for us. For me, this is just about efficiency. The most efficient way to get to an advanced level in Latin is to study the grammar and speak the language. That's just the quickest way to do it. So when students or parents come to me, and I have to say, most of the time, we've gotten to the point where most people who come to us, whether they're Latin students or parents of Latin students, it's very easy to convince them because they know nothing. So they have no experience of the language. So I can just tell them I could tell them anything, and I'm sure they'd believe me. But in fact,
we mean that in the nicest way possible.
Right. But I tell them the truth. I say the most efficient way to get there, and that's what they care about. They care about efficiency. They care about the student learning as well as possible, retaining it. And then, of course, a lot of students and parents care about doing well on standardized tests. Well, let's say it's all about standardized tests. It doesn't make any difference. The most effective way to get there is to make conversation a major part of the curriculum. Now, of course, the student also has to learn the grammar extremely well, has to know every detail of grammar, has to be able to repeat it back to you in an instant when you ask the student a question about grammar. But that's one half of it. And then the other half is actually using the language in a conversational context. So anyway, I'm sorry, I went on a little bit of a diatribe.
No, it's a great point. It's a great point, Andrew.
Good point, sir.
Absolutely. So, André, anything else you'd like to tell our audience about your experiences with Latin and how it really has just shaped everything in a new way for you?
Well, as I've said before, learning classical languages have changed my mind, especially Latin. Mm-hmm. Well, I've learned a lot with Anglo-Saxon and Sanskrit and Babylonian now, but I must say that Latin is by far the best language, the best classical language. Maybe because our civilization is Latin. The Romans gave us our Western civilization, and learning Latin is like being in contact with my past, with my ancestors. The same way I felt when I saw, if you remember the beginning of the podcast, I mentioned the Latin grammar in French that I saw. I felt like I had to get in contact with the whole idea of learning the language of my ancestors and of a people who gave us so much as the Romans did.
Yeah, and I mean, let me just jump in here. Latin is also our linguistic parent as well. Right. Now, for you, André, maybe both of your parents were Latin, and for Kostas and for me, one of our parents was Latin, and the other was Germanic. But either way, Latin is our linguistic parent. And if you want to know English well, I mean, and this goes back to my uncle. He said to me, I remember, I didn't know English grammar until I learned Latin. And he's certainly not the only person who's ever said that. You hear that a lot.
There are many students saying that today, right now, somewhere.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think that Kostas, André, that's probably good for today. I want to thank you, André, for coming and for talking about your experiences.
Yeah. It was wonderful to speak
Gracias.
to you, André, and what you're doing is incredibly inspiring, and we really salute you for all your wonderful work, not only with Latin, but all these other languages and subjects as well. So we very
Thanks,
much
Kostas.
enjoyed speaking to you today. And for you out there, we hope you enjoyed the conversation as well, and we would invite you, if you did, to please subscribe to our podcast, and please also check out our Gray Fox website, in particular the Gray Fox Archives, where we have our free Latin conversation textbook, which we've referenced several times before in previous episodes. And also located there is some more information on the conversation class that we offer for the teachers weekly on Skype. And all of that is located at archives.greyfoxtutors.com. And Gray Fox is spelled Greyfox. So that's archives.greyfoxtutors.com. And we also invite you to email us any questions or comments that you might have about what you've heard at podcast@greyfoxtutors.com. And if you're watching and listening to us on YouTube, please click the subscribe button and then the little bell up in the corner so that you get a notification every time we put a new episode up. So once again, I'll just echo Andrew and André. It was great today, gentlemen, to have this chat, and very much enjoyed it. And hopefully, André, we can have you back sometime. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, and until next time, thank you all for listening as well, and we will see you on the next episode of the Gray Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. Valete!
Valete.
Valete.